Today's lecture is titled The Present Conjuncture, Illiberalism, War and Violence, a Perspective. This sounds like it's got reverb and it's doing some cool things. I'm going to very speedily read through a short version of our speaker's biography so that I can hand over to the people that have the real words. Professor Anthony Bogues is a writer, scholar, curator, a documentary filmmaker, and the inaugural director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. He is currently the Asimesa Professor of Humanities and Africana Studies at Brown. Bogues' research interests include literary and cultural history, radical political thought, critical theory, Caribbean and African politics, as well as Haitian, Caribbean, and African diasporic art and curatorial studies. His publications include Black Heretics and Black Prophets, Radical Political Intellectuals in 2003, Empire of Liberty, Power, Freedom, and Desire in 2010, From Revolution in the Tropics to Imagined Landscapes, The Art of Edouard Duval-Carré in 2014, and Metamorphosis, The Art of Edouard Duval-Carré in 2017, to name a few. Most recently, Bogues co-authored In Slavery's Wake, Making Black Freedom in the World in 2024, with Paul Gardulo and Joanna Obenda. And Bogues has been the executive producer of 3 very exciting documentaries, one of which we had the pleasure to launch last week. If you didn't see it, join our mailing list. Quick plug. Bogues was the co-editor with Raffaello Dali of a special issue on Black Thought in 2017 of the Italian journal Filosofia Politica. Additionally, Bogues has co-curated and curated shows in the United States, the Caribbean, South Africa, and France. He is a member of the editorial collective for the journal Boundary 2 and was an honorary professor at the Center for Africana Studies at the University of Cape Town from 2006 to 2017. Bogues is a member of the scientific committee of Le Centre d'Art in Port-au-Prince in Haiti and the convener of the international project, A Global Project. His most recent curated exhibition was the co-curation of In Slavery's Wake at the National African American Museum of History and Culture. Bogues is Distinguished Visiting Professor in Visual Identities in Art and Design at VIAD at the University of Johannesburg. Quick? Thank you. We're alive. And I'm going to read a very brief version of the biography of our respondent. Nell Bokupa, LLP, is a writer and cultural producer interested in the past, power, and the sublime present. Their latest solo exhibition, Nelson Mandela is Dead, exploring the political and historical significance of the death of Nelson Mandela, was hosted by the Nelson Mandela Foundation between 2023 and 2024, and was further curated in shows by the Desmond and V. Tutu Legacy Foundation, as well as at the Stellenbosch University Museum. Notable cultural projects by Nell Bokupa are July's People, the documentary playing downstairs for anyone who wants to visit afterwards, a documentary meditation on the 2021 July unrest, Blackness is Where Language Comes to Die, an article on the extrajudicial killing of Collins Koza during COVID-19's lockdowns in South Africa, that was later prescribed as required reading in the sociology and anthropology departments at the Universities of Cape Town and the Witwatersrand, respectively, as well as Ande, a regular column Nell wrote at the Daily Maverick, where they explored questions of South African identity systems, power, and the past. Nell's prolific publishing, which includes Harry, the Johannesburg Review of Books, many South African media publications and international academic journals, started in 2009, where they wrote about a swimming gala at Chippy High School for boys, which they attended. He is currently co-authoring a book on the meanings, grammars, and significance of the South African taxi industry with James Corder, whose working title is Afdarobot, to be published by NB Publishers in 2026. Nell is adamant that the birds work in the bourgeoisie. And with that, I introduce Professor Anthony Bogues, and afterwards, immediately, response by Neo Mokuba.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming out. Thanks very much to Nisa for that introduction, and thanks to Veer for organizing this particular event. It's my second visit to this space, the Forge, and I think it's quite frankly a remarkable space. So I want to congratulate the people who have set up this space. And I really hope that it will be around for a very long time. I want to begin my remarks with an observation. It is an observation about the world in which we live in. The old is dying. The new is aggressively coming to life. And therefore we live in tumultuous time. One in which human life is not just fragile, because human life has always been fragile, but one in which our human life today are constructed around numerous death worlds. Worlds in which death is both a spectacle and an ordinary, everyday habit. The death I speak of are not states of exceptions, but are ways in which human beings live and then die. And they die in such a way so that human life can only be told, or is increasingly, can only be told in tales of death. We inhabit a world today in which many of us, or millions of us, are not able to dream because life is crushed by forms of violence. Practices of violence which seek to create forms of extinction. Technologies of violence which operate at velocities, at speeds that explode and scatter to the wind or physical fragments. This, therefore, is indeed a time of crisis. But it is not crisis in the usual sense in which we use that word. That is, crisis denoting intense difficulty or a turning point. But rather, we are at a certain kind of turning point in which various catastrophes shape our world, in which various catastrophes shape the various spaces we inhabit, and perhaps more importantly, create what I've referred to as these multiple death worlds. In such a situation, the time is not out of joint. Indeed, we are in new times. In 1952, in a remarkable text by Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask, which many of you, I'm sure, have heard about or have read, Fanon makes the point that as human beings, he says, we are both biology and culture. And that therefore, within that frame of us being both biology and culture, I want to suggest to you, along with following somebody like Sylvia Wynton, that we are narrative beings, that we actually tell stories to make our lives, that we tell stories about ourselves and about our world to make our life possible. But today, the world is in a dangerous place because the stories that we tell are not about lives, but tales of death. Fanon also black-skinned white males, also made the point that a new beginning was always possible. And in the conclusion of the Wretched of the Earth, that remarkable chapter, final chapter, he makes the point that really what we are trying to do, he says, is to leave Europe and to create a new human. The catastrophic nature of this current crisis in which we live in is really about a drive by those who rule the world to exterminate the possibilities of any new beginnings and to reanimate human life on this planet within the frames of a kind of nostalgic colonial modernity. We are, therefore, in a moment in which I would want to submit to you that the underside of liberalism is now becoming the dominant mode of political rule, and as such, the death worlds that I speak about becomes the order of the day. It is this deep transformation of an emergence of illiberalism that I want to spend some time thinking about this evening. In conventional terms, political terms, we like to think that liberalism is really a dominant ideology, and that really it still rules much of the world. And that's how we like to think. But I want to suggest to you that after 1980, with the emergence of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Helmut Kohl, that liberalism began to change its nature, and we were entered into a new conjuncture in the world. But people were very happy, or the rulers were very happy, because they would argue, many of them argued, if you read their journals and so on, that 1980 and after that, the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, 1990s, meant that, as some of them would write, one particular scholar, that we were now at the end of history. And that all that was needed was new technical advice in which poverty and other things would be taken care of. That all the solutions that face humankind were now just technical solutions. Part of liberalism, as you all know, is a certain kind of representative democracy, what I like to call electoral democracy. And that this electoral democracy is at the heart of the liberal project. At the heart of the liberal project, it is also said, is a certain kind of liberty, a certain kind of also attraction and an understanding of property. What is not usually said is that the way in which liberalism emerged was through a particular set of writers and political practices. One of them was a man called John Locke. Locke was a shareholder in the Royal African Company of England and was also a framer of the Carolinas Constitution, slave constitutions in the United States. And Locke said two things which were important. Firstly, he made the point that slavery for him just meant that you could be a slave if you were in debt peonage, or, he argued, if you were a prisoner of war. He's writing in the 1700s, but that obviously definition of slavery would ignore racial slavery and enslaved Africans and the slave trade that was occurring at that time. But he also said that in relationship to property, that one could only take possession of property when it was mixed with your labor. What that meant was that the property in the land of the indigenous peoples, particularly the Americas, was therefore not considered to mean any single thing, and therefore the indigenous population could be dispossessed. What is the point that I'm making? I'm making that the liberal project, which begins in the writings of Locke and then is continued in the political practices of the American Revolution, that undergirding that liberal project was racial slavery and the European colonial project, as well as the dispossession of the indigenous people. What I think is important is to understand that that project, the underside, was really also an authoritarian project. The colonial project was not a project in which there was any democracy. The project of racial slavery was not a project in which there was any democracy. All these projects were emerging at the moment of liberalism, undergirded the liberal project. And therefore my point is that illiberalism emerged simultaneously with liberalism. And that if we want to try and understand today, then we need to understand the emergence of both simultaneously and how illiberalism, racial slavery, and colonialism and genocide becomes at the underside and then becomes part of an integral part of the liberal project, what is called the liberal project. I'm not saying that the present moment that we live in is one of racial slavery and colonialism. Rather, I am saying this. I am saying that history as a process sometimes operates like the sedimented deposits, in which, as it operates as sediment deposit, it carries within it certain practices and certain understandings and certain narratives, which then get worked and reworked in the present moment. And then therefore what I'm also arguing is that in this present conjuncture, in this present moment, that what we have is the illiberalism that has been there from the beginning of colonial modernity, which has readapted and reworked itself into the politics and ideas of what we are as human beings in the world today. So therefore, I'm trying to discuss and to think about this movement of illiberalism into a particular conjuncture. I've made reference here to somebody whom you should all know about one day. That is a man called Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall thinks about what, and he's dead now, but Stuart Hall thought a lot about living in England, from Jamaica, where I'm from. Spent a lot of time, died in London. But Stuart Hall thought about a conjuncture, thought about what is a specific moment at any point in time. And this is what he says. He says, typically, a conjuncture involves assembling elements in a formation. And there's no single unity in this assemblage, he would argue. He says, it assembles itself into moments, and they are fused. But he says that you have to map these particular moments to begin to understand the actual history, as to understand the historical moment, or what some would call the moment of the present itself. So what are these particular lines, if you wish, of practice? These kind of lines that this moment, that dominate this particular moment, or if they don't dominate it, are beginning to appear in this moment. First, I talked about, yes, the colonial modern, and how the colonial modern, particularly the idea of sexual colonialism, has begun to work itself in the present. But I want to go back a little bit further. I want to go back, or not further, I want to put one thing in the mix, which sometimes writers don't do. Between the Berlin Conference of 1885, there was the formalization of the European colonial project in Africa. And that formalization, with all its practices of violence, pacification, and so on, continued right up until the Second World War, right after the Second World War. But we should remember that the sun never set on the British Empire. It's not my phrase, the phrase of one of the rulers of England. And that therefore, right up until 1945, the illiberalism ruled the vast number of countries in the world. It's not something that we think about. We kind of forget about it, particularly if we were born in 2000, that somehow that this period before 1945 was a period for old men and old women to think about. But essentially, what we need to understand is that from the 1885 Berlin Conference right up until the independence of India in 1947, the world was a colonial world. The vast majority of the peoples of the world lived under colonialism. Now, post-1945, beginning with the Indian independence, a new period or a new conjuncture emerged in the world. So let's look at it this way. There was a period and a conjuncture of colonialism that lasted for a long time. British Empire, sun never set. From the independence of India in 1947 and then followed quickly by Ghana in 1957, another period, another conjuncture opened up. And that conjuncture that opened up was the world decolonization process, with the only anomaly being South Africa, who then declared apartheid in 1948. So what is the point here? The point I'm making is that if you have a world that is constructed essentially through colonialism and racial slavery, by the middle of the 20th century, that world began to shift. And therefore, a new conjuncture opened up. And we don't see it that way. We don't understand that 1945, 1946, 1947, after the Second World War, we were now into a new period. It is a period of decolonization, world decolonization, and it's a period in which I like to call a one of constitutional decolonization. Because the major form of decolonization after the 1940s was constitutional decolonization. Many of you may or may not know that, of course, by the late 1960s and so on, we had armed African liberation struggles in this country, in this continent, particularly in the southern parts of this country. But that there was a whole set of discussions in the 1950s about what? About constitutional decolonization versus armed struggle. And the actual conference on the African continent for that was the All Africa People's Conference in Ghana in 1958, in which both Fanon was there and Nelson Mandela was there. And there was a debate about what was the best form to prosecute the independence and decolonization struggle. In that period of constitutional decolonization, there was the possibility, I only talk about possibility, there was the possibility that somehow the world would change, particularly for those of us who come from what is today called the global south. All of that began to fall, I would want to suggest to you, by 1976, 1973, 1974, and 1975. And the event that marks that collapse, the beginning of the collapse, is the actual overthrow in Chile of President Allende. And that becomes really important because what then happens is that the people who are involved is not just the Central Intelligence Agency, that the people who are involved in the reconstruction of Chile after Allende is overthrown come from the University of Chicago and were the founders of the contemporary neoliberal project. So that Chile then became, after the fall of Allende, the very first space in which neoliberalism began to be experimented with. But it was also the space in which there was an fair authoritarian and fascist ruler, and so thousands of people, as you know, died in Chile. By the time you get to Reagan, Thatcher, and Kohl in 1980, what you get is the consolidation of neoliberalism, and therefore the transformation of and the creation of a new conjuncture. This is no longer a decolonization or no longer a conjuncture of constitutional decolonization. This is a conjuncture of neoliberalism. To go back to Paul, what are the characteristics of this neoliberalism? Firstly, market fundamentalism. What does that mean? That means that all human activity, all our relations as human beings are essentially organized within a frame, our matrices, if you want to use that language, of the simple cost-benefit analysis. Simply, that we don't think about relations with each other unless we think through a cost-benefit analysis and subject those relations to that analysis. Secondly, that this kind of thing, although that makes the market fundamental, also is not just an economic revolution. And this is the point that Hall makes a lot in his writings. It is also an ideological revolution. And in that ideological revolution, there is the creation of a common sense. That is the common sense a naturalized common sense of who and what we are as human beings. And therefore, that common sense was supposed to guide us. Remember, I come back to Winter, the narrative. We are narrative beings. We are all sorts of things, but we are also narrative beings, and therefore the stories that we tell ourselves become important. And what this means within the neoliberal project is simply this, that the political imagination, the radical imagination of something that might be different, is actually crushed. And it is not just that the political imagination is crushed, it is that history is also, and it becomes sanitized. So that if you look at the actual history books of many countries, after 1980, one of the things you will see is that they don't talk about colonialism. They don't talk about racial slavery. They don't talk about the struggles against these things, because what you want to do is to construct a different history, a history that would then help to create a common sense that, I'm going to use Jamaican here, Creole, that a sort of thing set. In other words, if a sudden thing set, then there's nothing you can do about it because I saw it set. As Mr. Thatcher says, there is no alternative. This, I would want to suggest, all of this in the neoliberal project consolidates the figure of the human as Homo economicus. And as it consolidates the figure of the human as Homo economicus, then we feel as human beings, many of us across the world, feel that there's nothing, we just have to participate in this project in whatever way that we can, because there's simply no alternative. All of this participation, all of this construction of the neoliberal project is also done within the context of anti-black racism and white supremacy. It is the anti-black racism and white supremacy don't move, don't get lost. It becomes the heart of the project as well. So what you get is neoliberalism reorganizing itself around anti-black racism, reorganizing itself around market fundamentalism, and also reorganizing itself about what the figure of the human is. What I want to suggest to you is that in this moment, that what we are seeing is two things. One, the replacement of some elements of liberalism as we know it, i.e. some of the things, the norms, free speech, so-called, and I put all these in quotation marks, free speech, certain clutch of human rights, the question of rule of law, and all of this is in questions I put in quotation marks. But what you are seeing is that the present moment, which is an authoritarian moment, is overturning some of those things of liberalism, but also, quite frankly, integrating itself into elements of liberalism, particularly around the business of the market fundamentals. Therefore, what you are getting at this moment is a struggle between forms of liberalism and the way in which illiberalism, which I talked about, now emerges and is seeking to overcome and overthrow, if you will. And I'm using those words very carefully, both overcome and overthrow the so-called elements of a liberal project. At the heart of that is obviously white supremacy. And it is not just white supremacy, it is what some of us call secular colonial ideology. Because what at the heart of it is a way in which there's a nostalgia about what white secular colonialism is and was, and how you can get back that and construct it in the contemporary moment. And so alongside that is the idea of blackness and the black body as a disposable body. And alongside that is a way in which one has to think about, or one has to practice violence. And it is, therefore, I want to move to this particular thing about violence and trying to think about violence in this period, in this new conjuncture in which authoritarianism is trying to replace liberalism. Another way in which, or another element of this, is the way in which politics then also emerges. Politics, and I'm not here talking about radical politics, but probably politics as a practice of the elite really then becomes an attempt to control the imagination. But the attempt to control the imagination is through the development of what is called fake news. And it is really amazing to think through how what has happened, particularly with technology, social media, and so on, that what you get now is that are not just different centers of news, but different centers of false news. And it becomes almost difficult to check if this is true or not. And important to that in that is AI. I'll give you a concrete example. Toure, fellow from Burkina Faso, has become a kind of popular figure for many people. Over the last week, I have watched social media where he was supposed to have written sets of letters to political personalities in Jamaica. He hasn't. But the fake news suggests, therefore, that he has done this. And so younger people who follow social media are now talking about him writing these letters of support, or these letters talking about some recent elections in Jamaica. Those letters have not been written because the people who you're supposed to have written them to had never received those letters. But that what you then get is a manipulation of our imagination and a manipulation of the news in ways, therefore, where we think that certain things are happening when in fact they're not happening. It's a kind of practice of politics, in my view, in which the level of ideology, that these things cannot be now dispelled by facts, but ideology actually do not become belief, but actually becomes a fantasy. And this is the real danger, or one of the real dangers of this moment, where it is not just an operation of a construction of belief about A or B, but it is a fantasy that has been constructed through these fake news that make us think about A or B. And when it comes to fantasies, those of you who think about some of these things, you will know that you can't just dispel it by the truth. You can't say to somebody, this is a fantasy because this is the evidence, that is the evidence. It doesn't work that way. Those of us who live in the United States know, for example, that when President Obama became president, one of the things that happened is that people said, where's your birth certificate? You weren't born here. You're not an American. And that even when he produced his birth certificate to say, I was born in a United States state, like it's Hawaii, that didn't dispel things. People said, oh, you could have made it up. Oh, it's not a real certificate. So that the business, therefore, of what is the fantasy that is constructed in this period is something that those of us who want to live a different life and to think about changing the systems have to begin to think about how do you tackle that particular question. So fantasy, therefore, and ideology, as ideology becomes fantasy, it is not false consciousness as we used to think about it. It is not just a simple a set of beliefs, but rather it is something that is a fantasy that becomes a kind of network of ideas, a network of belief constructed by fake news and social media that then, in fact, governs our psychic. I want to shift from that to think about war and violence. In much of the writing on this subject, war, violence, and power are considered as separate. Violence is seen as operating separately from power, and power is seen as operating separately from questions of authority. I want to suggest to you that that particular conventional frame of violence is difficult to apply to the condition of black folks and former colonized people. That in fact, violence and power, historically for colonized and racialized enslaved people, was really power itself. It is what I like to call power in the flesh. In other words, you can only command the people in authoritarian systems of colonialism and racial slavery, command them to obey through a certain kind of torture, through a certain kind of violence that only operates in the flesh, and it operates in the flesh to make the body do something. So questions of torture, questions of beating, all of those things and so on, and questions of even killing, all of those things are forms of violence that operate as power, but they operate in the flesh to make the body, to command the body to do certain things. So therefore, one of the things I would want to suggest to you is that what we are seeing in the world today is the re-emergence of that kind of violence that operates in the flesh. That kind of violence that operates in the flesh, that kind of creates conditions for genocide. It is able to do that because of the vast technological advances that we have had in the world today. So you have, many of you will know, AI-powered systems that target people. You have what is called autonomous weapons. You have cyber warfare. And of course, you have drones. At the heart of all of this weaponry is what military people would call precision strikes, the way in which you can use these weapons to do target selection and to, in fact, murder people. Those of you who listen to the radio would have heard last night of some strikes in Qatar. Those of you who listen to the radio all the time would have heard of the numerous places in Gaza that have drone strikes, and would have seen pictures of the children and civilians who are being killed. So what you have is a situation, therefore, in which there is a velocity and there's a construction of war in which human beings are no longer human beings, but human beings are animals or subhumans, and where therefore the weapons of death can strike anywhere at any time without any particular consideration. This particular kind of velocity, or this kind of construction of weaponry, organizes, as we know, or challenges the international law, but it doesn't matter to those who practice. And so what you have increasingly in the world are states who practice these kind of things on civilian populations, who punish populations in order to get them out and in order for a certain kind of political objective that they may have. Sometimes that objective, quite frankly, is extermination. And I think that one of the things that we need to think about, living, and I know South Africans think about this, one of the things that we need to think about is who is being exterminated and why their people are being exterminated. And one of the things that strikes me when thinking through this is that this is not about the business of extermination alone. It is about extermination to create extraction, which is why you will get comments like Gaza can be turned into a Rivera. This kind of thing, in which there's also the transformation of the battlefield, where it doesn't necessarily mean that you now have boots on the ground, but is really about a new experience of the everyday kill, to me is something that is new in this particular conjuncture. All of this means what? Means that instead of life, death becomes a possibility. So we live in this world today, a world which I would argue is increasingly governed by illiberalism, by various forms of authoritarianism, creating conditions for the contemporary catastrophic crisis. And so we need to think about, how do we resist this? What is it that we can do, rather than think about any kind of despair? Every social order creates, I'm here following Sylvia Winter's work and expanding on it, every social order creates what I like to call a mode of being human. That is how we are as human beings. Radical anti-colonial thought from Fanon, from Cabral, from Sylvia Winter, from Du Bois and others. Radical anti-colonial thought, Steve Biko and others, have made it clear that at the core of the Black anti-colonial struggle was really the question of what we are as human beings. And therefore it is to understand, to go back to that radical anti-colonial struggle, radical anti-colonial thought, to think about what we are, and that we are not the monsters that the elite of the world are now trying to create. And part of that, part of resisting that, therefore, and understanding the conjuncture and resisting what the elites are trying to do, is the business of disobedience. And so we are faced with this idea of disobeying. And what are the conditions for disobeying? And to use the words of Bob Marley from Babylon System, how do we refuse to be what you want us to be? We are what we are, and that's the way it's going to be. And therefore, the idea of disobedience is an idea of how masses of people can engage in a politics, can engage in a process in which we are refusing. And we are refusing to be what people really want us to be. And therefore, then there are consequences to that refusal. Consequences to that refusal, and what are the other things that you need to do once you have decided to refuse. Part of that refusal is to think about the radical imagination. Is to think about What are the possible alternatives? What are the different forms of life to what is now being proposed by the elites of this world? We are possible, and I'm not saying this is absolutely certain, but I have a sense of a certain danger as I travel to many places. We are at a juncture of human life on earth in which we require the work of the radical imagination based upon refusal, based upon refusing to be what others want us to be, and then acting upon that refusal. Part of that refusal, part of that disobeying, is really about us reclaiming what might be human to us, and human in us. I want to come back to Fanon. Come, let us leave Europe and build a different man. Here he's talking about man. But he says that every time Europe talks about man, it mutilates man. What he wants to think about and asks us to think about is that we think about the new man, or what I will argue today, the new human, and what possibilities of that is that you begin to think about this question of freedom and what real freedom might look like. Not the liberty that was said. One of the things that I say to people is that if you think about liberty, you think about what the American Revolution talked about. That was a liberty in which people were allowed to enslave others. If you think about emancipation, you think about what the British gave people in Cape Town and what they gave us in the Caribbean. Emancipation is a process from above. That is, you are given something. Freedom is not something that anybody can give you. Freedom is something you take. And freedom is something that you practice. And as Fanon makes the point, it is a freedom which you always have to practice in relationship to others. He says in Black Skin, White Mask, was not my freedom given to me to build the world of the you. It is this building of the world of the you, rather than the world of strangulation and death, that I would like us to think about. It is this world of building the you, which Fanon and other radical anti-colonial thinkers thought about and tried to practice, which I think may be able to shine a light at this moment. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Prof Bogues. I want to start by saying that there's nothing really well-constructed I could possibly say seconds after you've spoken. Seconds after you've spoken. In the sense that all I can really do is really give my first impressions. And first impressions in a kind of chaotic, disordered, messy kind of fashion. I want to title this response, Is History a Process or a Soup? And I'll come to what I'm trying to articulate by process, a soup. But first I want to say that where I'm coming from is a kind of urban sensibility. I grew a lot, not all, but a significant part of my kind of political and maybe somewhat intellectual consciousness through things like Robes Must Fall, through Freeze Must Fall, through watching Yizo Yizo. And so there's a kind of practicality that I'm very much interested in, that I'm deeply invested in, that I hold as kind of sacred. I think that there's a way that sometimes you might also articulate it as politics with a small p, as opposed to politics writ large. I want to kind of ground this response in who I am and how I'm able to see the things that I'm able to know and understand. I grew up in many places in Gauteng. My first memory was of Zondi in Soweto, where I was left from my parents to be raised by a grandmother. Then we moved to Katlehong. Then we moved to Bruma for a little bit. Then we moved back to Katlehong, to Boksburg, to Kensington, and otherwise. And there are ways that I learned what it meant to be alive in this world through those particular experiences. And so, with that kind of background, these are my first kinds of impressions. I'm interested in this idea of conjuncture. I think that in many ways, I agree. And I think that one of the most tangible and holdable and seeable expressions of conjuncture would, in South Africa at least, especially in Gauteng, especially in KZN, would be the 2021 unrest. Here we saw multiple layers of things converging at the same time to produce this thing that we're still unable to understand, to fathom, to make sense of, to know, this new kind of monster. But at the same time, it wasn't new. It comes from things that we know, things that we understand, from the COVID-19 lockdowns and how it humiliated poor people. It kept a lot of people who are poor locked in their homes where they couldn't pursue income. It happened at a time where I think already we were over about 50% youth unemployment in this country, a severe kind of context. And we can talk about all the other kinds of layers, the political aspects as well, of Jacob Zuma, of identity, of ethnicity. And so I see those kinds of traits through my own eyes in this word conjuncture. But at the same time, it's also been a long time coming. At the same time, we've seen it in different ways. At the same time, I'm wondering how new it is. For many years, we've spoken about this idea of necropolitics. We've seen people write about things like Homo Sesa with the Gumban. And the thing that I'm trying to be provocative about, mainly, is this idea that human beings are really good at seeing patterns. That's why optical illusions work, because our eyes, our senses are limited, and they can trick us into seeing things that may not necessarily be as present as they might otherwise be. I'm also really interested in this idea of market fundamentalism, and I think that there's something really to be said about that. And it's something that I would also know living in this country, in this time, in this city, this province. For instance, Prof Anthony, he described it as human beings being turned into economic animals. He says that the processes of apartheid, of colonialism in South Africa, turned especially Black people into economic animals. That, for instance, when we think about the 40-40-40 rule, this idea that townships or otherwise labor reserves, well, townships, were built to be 40 kilometers away from the city on a 40 square meter plot that would require you to spend 40% of your income going back and forth to work in the cities. You're turned into an economic animal, your whole world being, how you understand value, things about your time, your identity, what is worth pursuing. It's very much centered around, will it bring income? Will it make me live? In other cases in Africa, there's this one story that I find really, really amazing of African mosques, and I think it's under the term capitalist realism, which I think might be similar to market fundamentalism in some ways. But there's this kind of story where these European tourists come to, let's say, Bruma Flea Market, over there by Bruma. And they find this mosque there. The mosque is beautiful. It's made out of wood. It's hand carved. And they want to know, what does it mean? What does it mean? Because it must mean something. This is Africa. There must be hectic meaning and spirituality and the rest of it. And the seller says, oh yeah, no. This one, my friend, it comes from Gambia. It comes from some mystical place in Africa, real Africa. You know, and it's used in these particular ways, and you know, when you turn 18, you're given this mosque and you must go outside, you know, then he fashions this story. What he's trying to do is sell the mosque. He wants to get the income. But then he produces this narrative about himself, about the mosque, about this world, to sell to this European tourist. And there are ways that these narratives that we also self-produce come back to eat us, come back to bite us. You know what I mean? Yeah. In a previous talk hosted by Viet, I believe, it was at, where is it now? Bruce Books in Brixton. Desire Maria said that we have to heal our imagination. First time hearing those words, we have to heal our imagination. My initial instinct was, oh wow, that's really profound. This idea that we need to come to a place where we are able to imagine in the ways that we could imagine before the catastrophe happened, before the world ended, before colonialism, before apartheid. We must remake ourselves and remake our imaginations. But then on thinking about it further, I thought, no, that can't be it. And I don't know very specifically what desire meant, but this is what I heard. And this is how I responded later on. I said to myself that, no, healing is not coming to a place where it never happened, but healing is accepting that it did and moving with it. And so in some ways, if history is a soup, we need to eat the soup. When I was listening to you, Prof, I felt suspicious, I think, if I'm honest. And I felt suspicious for many different kinds of reasons. Number one, no, I have a very personal relationship with academia and intellectualism. I feel rejected by it, and the rest of it. But when you say words, I wonder, and I'm asking you to wonder with me, do we hear the same thing and do we mean the same thing? A word like blackness or anti-blackness. I have my experience of anti-blackness, and I'm sure you do too. But I think it was Kodwo Eshun who spoke about how African American blackness becomes this global signifier of what blackness needs to mean for everybody. How blackness is exported from America, and we all need to eat it as well. But does my blackness mean the same thing as yours? And of course it doesn't. But of course it does. And of course we're kind of intermingled and pushing and fighting for space. But in some ways, we are also underneath this American concept of blackness. Because blackness, African Americanness, is intimately linked to the empire. And we are affected by the American empire. And we are in many ways powerless to resist it. And so we have this interesting, intimate, and sometimes violent relationship with Black Americanness, and we see it all the time on Twitter. So I'm suspicious. And what I've also seen increasingly in kind of urban contexts, online as well, is a growing, and sometimes people call it a kind of anti-intellectualism. And I think that it is. And I think that a big part of this kind of response to quoting Fanon is a kind of anti-intellectual urge. But I think it is also a way to understand it as, well, where am I? Am I in that story of this world, these large meta-narratives of Locke and, what did I write here? Of Locke and Fanon and Morrison and Agamben and otherwise? Is my world central in that narrative? How much of what you've said can I actually meaningfully understand in the world that I live in? And so my questions while listening was, would having this conversation in the middle of town, partly in some ways, and the kinds of questions, and these are very rhetorical, and I'm not being specific in these ways, but almost kind of symbolic, right? You know, where are the mind dumps in conversations about liberalism? Where are the taxis? Where's the IFP? Where are the bodies beneath the mind dumps? Where are the migrant laborers? Where is Canada law? And in some ways, having listened to similar kinds of narratives being told, I began feeling as though my world is kind of parochial, is so small, is a kind of province of history. and not in the capital. Beyond Nelson Mandela, I'm suspicious of Nelson Mandela. Oh, of course, we need to be suspicious. And, and be critical and take what we can and what we must and what we do and honor what we will, but also be suspicious. For instance, this idea of, constitutional decolonization. For me, constitutional decolonization is also a necessary oxymoron. And I think, and I say that in the sense that South African law is premised very heavily on Roman Dutch law. It comes on a boat in many ways. And for me, for a long time, we tried and we have been operating in a kind of pluralistic legal environment where we have African customary law, but it's often seen as though it's underneath Roman Dutch law, the Constitution. You know what I mean? It has these relationships to it. But there's a contestation of what does justice mean? What does order mean? What does the rule of law mean when that law is premised on Roman Dutch law? For instance, I think about the theft, the primacy of the crime of theft, and how theft, and alongside murder, kind of rises to this place of serious importance. And the history of the law of theft really comes from the history of ownership itself, and more specifically the ownership of land, and how, and I'm suspicious of myself, even in thinking through these ideas, and how the idea that you could own land is a relatively new idea. For the longest time, human beings could not imagine owning space. It's not, thinkable. Until you have the agricultural revolution, and revolutions really in different parts of the world, where instead of going out to go find the food, the berries, the buck, and otherwise, you grow it yourself. You nurture the cattle yourself. You want to keep them. And you want to keep them safe, and so we develop this idea of, well, this area is mine. In Southern Africa, in South Africa, how that translated was more along the lines of duty, that I need to maintain this area because so many people depend on it, on the cows here, on the vegetables and the fruits here, on the space here, and otherwise. But then came Roman Dutch law, and it was very forceful, this idea of absolute ownership, this idea that I can own it and to the exclusion of all else. It's not based in duty, it's not based in responsibility or being accountable to a people, but it's personal. And I'm trying to kind of feed that into this idea of the oxymorons within constitutional decolonization. I'm not necessarily trying to romanticize violent revolution. I think it has many issues there too. In some ways it's kind of impractical. But I do want to be suspicious, even as we embrace it, this idea of constitutional decolonization. Where do I want to go next? I have little scatters over here.
And need to conclude.
Okay, well, let me move towards concluding. And I think this point is rather made. But I think, so for instance, this idea of history as a soup. I'm thinking about whether or not the Dutch East India Company could have imagined Cis Russia. If you don't know about Cis Russia, it's, for lack of a better word, it's a terrible word, it's that kind of mostly Sotho, Bedi, and otherwise kind of cultural cloth. You know what I mean? The different patterns and otherwise, beautiful stuff. They have it all across Africa. What some people don't know is that a lot of that is a response to the Dutch West, I think sometimes India Company, bringing in that cloth from places like Indonesia and South Asia and otherwise, in South-West Asia. And how we took it and we embraced it and we made sense of it. I bring that up as a way of trying to say that sometimes you eat the soup. Sometimes history is not necessarily as directional, as specific as a process. Sometimes it's random. Sometimes it's the universe. Sometimes, you know what I mean? And yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to say. I'm wondering around how much of the lives of the people in this room are spoken for in narratives around liberalism and illiberalism. and how much of our life, our world, can be understood through this thing.
Yeah, let me just respond very quickly to these really very provocative remarks. One, to say that constitutional decolonization is or was a historical process, which essentially meant what I like to call flag independence, which is that the only thing you had was a flag and you populated the United Nations. But the actual social transformation of the colonial society would never happened. Never happened in Africa. It never happened in the Caribbean, where I come from. But that one recognizes that there was a process where my grandparents and my grandfather was part of an anti-colonial constitutional decolonization, where he felt that, okay, if we were independent, then we could do certain things. He was wrong. But one honors that, not to say, oh, my grandfather was silly, but one honors that the fact of what he attempted to do, and then what was left on to left on to my generation. But that's the first thing. Constitutional decolonization is a historical process, but that also very importantly only did not transform these colonies. We're creating all these nations in the United Nations, right? And that we joined the world, not as colonies, but as independent countries, but did really make a lot of significance into changing the world. The second point I will want to make to your comments is that I think that I don't think history travels in linear lines. I think it is in fits and starts. I think that one of the things that strikes me, and which is why I talk about sedimentary deposit, is how a project of secular colonialism readapts and reworks itself. But it readapts and reworks itself in ways that are not necessarily the old ways, right? It readapts itself into a new way. I mean, like, as I said to people, I come from the Caribbean. My great-grandparents were enslaved people. I don't live on a plantation, right? They grew up and lived on a plantation. So I am not a slave in the way that they were slaves. That's a new condition. But what is interesting is that the set of ideas that govern their life and govern anti-black life, and anti-black racism, finds itself as ideas that rework themselves into the elite and into the society today. And I take the point very much about African American and blackness. And there's a phrase that I tend to use, which is called imperial blackness, all right? But I also believe that there is a black world. And it is not that the South Africans are the key people in it, the Africans Americans, or the Jamaicans are the key people in it, but that there is a black world, and there's an anti-blackness in the world that runs the world in many ways, but that one black don't represent all blacks, right? But that because I don't think you can negate anti-blackness, the ways, and to negate anti-blackness, I think is to make a certain kind of mistake in thinking that, okay, it is because the African Americans have a certain position, that position doesn't represent Africans. That position doesn't represent Jamaicans. Ask the Jamaican, the majority black country, ask the Jamaican young man from the inner city walking down the road and black policemen take him and beat him. And beat him because he's black. And not just because he's black, but because he's comes from a certain class position. and is marked in that way. So that for me, it is a thing through. I mean, just look at the statistics. I mean, I'm actually working on a project thinking about global blackness, and everywhere I go, you can, whether it's Brazil, whether it's the Caribbean, whether it's South Africa, whether it is in Europe, just ask a question about what does it mean for you to be black, men and women, and they give you a list of things: poor education, police hostility and violence, lack of housing, lack of rights, and so on. They run through those things. It operates differently in every place. But what I'm fascinated with is how when I look at the list in the conversations, I kind of compare them, how similar the things are. But racial domination operates differently in every place. But what I was fascinated is that the consequences seem to be very similar for many young black people. My final point to the provoke, and I really appreciate the provocativeness. No, I do really appreciate is this, that I think that there is a way in which what one is trying to do is trying to follow him, quite frankly, people like Stuart Hall, I'm very frank, which is trying to understand what is the moment that we are in. Because the moment that we're in today is not the moment I grew up in. And I have to try and work, I have to say to myself, I think those of us who are critical intellectuals, and that's why I don't call myself an academic, right? Critical intellectuals have to try and understand what precisely is this moment. Because when you begin to understand that moment is how you can do politics seriously. If you don't understand the moment, you will say all sorts of things and do all sorts of things. But one of the keys, I think, to a politics that is important, is serious, that can, and here I'll just say it very clearly, that for me is transformation, is a change in which ordinary people are in charge of the society in which they live in. That's where I stand. That requires me to understand where is it that you're at. So you are not fighting, things, Sibilex that don't have any effect. And so thanks for that. But I thought it was just maybe important for me to say some of those things. Thanks.
Thank you so much. You can get a book signed. Good night, everyone. And thank you.